I'm Chris Farrell, and this is On Watch. Today we're very fortunate to be joined by Andy McCarthy, and you know Andy from National Review, from his being a contributor at Fox News, and of course his legal career as Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York with very successful terrorism prosecutions. He's a legal scholar, he's a brilliant writer, and we're very pleased to have Andy join us today. Welcome, Andy.
Chris, my pleasure.
Great. Hey, listen, there's two topics I want to cover with you. We'll just go to them briefly. Number one is I'd like your ideas, your opinions on what I view as a hysterical reaction to Attorney General Barr directing the investigation into the predicate for the entire Russia hoax. You know, the American public was lied to for 2+ years. That's now been exposed. And now that there's some effort at accountability, you see this really quite severe, profound, knee-jerk reaction from people like, Comey, McCabe, folks on the Hill. What's your take on this? Why is there such a visceral reaction to an effort for some kind of accountability?
Yeah, well, I hate to see people who, for a living, make cases on other people act like they're guilty, because that's part of the way that you sort of prove people are guilty. And I must say that if I had a predicate for investigating the president, and both the president and people who supported the president were trying to call me out on it and suggest that I was fabricating the whole thing, I wouldn't have to be asked twice. I'd be anxious for people to know the reason that I had opened the investigation. And if I had been quieted up until this point by the fact that things were classified, I'd be delighted to have them unclassified so I could show the world why I did what I did. So I frankly don't understand the pushback, other than if the pushback is for the reasons that we prosecutor types tell juries that people push back in situations like this, which is that they don't think they have a good explanation for what they did, and they're trying to get ahead of things like the Inspector General's report, which is coming probably within the next 4 weeks or so. What we've seen up till now, Chris, is that there may have been some basis to have a look at some of the people that were around President Trump in the campaign. Even that, I think, is something that needs to be fleshed out a little bit more. I look at the individual cases like, Manafort had some interesting connections to people in Ukraine, but I think that those people's connections to the Kremlin have been vastly overstated. Carter Page had an incident where he was approached in 2013 by Russian spies in order to try to reel him in, but he actually cooperated.
Yeah. The irony there is rich. Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's not a good, if they were worried that Carter Page was about to be not only a Russian asset, but the Russian asset who was going to be the Russians' entree to Donald Trump, under circumstances where the Russians who had tried to recruit Page had called him an idiot and were aware that he had cooperated with the Justice Department in the prosecution against them, and where Trump couldn't have picked Carter Page out of a lineup. I sort of don't know where they were going theoretically with that. But I don't have a problem with the idea that there were some facts out there that needed to be looked at. The question with an investigation always is really twofold. Number one, do you have a good reason to poke around a little bit? You might, and the threshold for that is pretty low. But then you get to, down to brass tacks, things like, seeking FISA warrants or dispatching.
Right.
I don't want to hurt anyone's tender sensibility, so I won't call them spies. Dispatching confidential informants or assets to talk to people. You don't do those things unless you have a much stronger predicate for suspicion, something that's really articulable. And when you're talking about transgressing a norm, and we do have a norm in this country against the potentially political use of investigative authorities, whether it's national security authorities or law enforcement authorities, you have to have a serious reason and good concrete evidence before you cross the threshold to use some of the tactics that were used here. And I think it seems to me that what the concern here is that they know they didn't have the predicate for that, and common sense things didn't happen. Like, I keep going back, Chris, to the FISA warrant and the footnote that they dropped about Christopher Steele's potential bias, in which they didn't reveal that he had a connection to the Clinton campaign, didn't reveal the fact that he was strenuously anti-Trump and wanted Trump defeated and all that jazz. If you take a page in a footnote to explain stuff like that, common sense ought to be telling you that you're doing that because you're not saying the things that you ought to be saying.
Yeah, I mean, they footnoted what's really a fatal flaw, right? I mean, it's a wink and nod, very dishonest, disingenuous technique. And, you touched on it a moment ago when you talked about, what's the prohibition against, undisclosed participation in U.S. organizations in the United States. I mean, that the Executive Order 12333 prohibits that from law enforcement and intelligence services. They knew that, which is why they manufactured this counterintelligence event in the UK. So they painted themselves as being reactive to a foreign counterintelligence threat, when in reality they were, had lined up and planned and were executing both technical and human intelligence and law enforcement activities against the political campaign. I mean, this is so foundationally, it's such an attack on the foundation. It's such a constitutional threat, but they just try to put lipstick on the pig and make it legit and have it be a foreign event that they imported as a counterintelligence event. And they knew damn well what they were doing, and they were very sophisticated at it. And to your point, they're scared because now they're caught, and they know what may come out of this.
Yeah, well, I do think that it's unquestioned, and I guess this goes into the next thing that you want to ask me about,
Right.
That there were a lot of people involved in this, and they were the people who were at the upper echelons of the intelligence community agencies and the Justice Department. So it's a little tough for them to argue that they were kind of drifting on events and not aware of the portents of what they were doing.
Yeah, and that goes, like I said, to our second point, which is that, folks hear the back and forth from various, officials, whether it's, Mueller folks, whether it's people on the Hill, whether it's Attorney General Barr, all the various, experts who opine on these things. But I like what is rarely discussed is sort of that in a normal situation, the operating environment, the day-to-day activities within the U.S. Attorney's Office, at the Department of Justice, in an FBI office, and how incredibly extraordinary, how outrageous it is that you have people like Clapper, Brennan, Bruce Orr, the intersection of these heavy hitters, and then they're all sort of claiming, gee, we didn't do anything out of the ordinary. So if you could, just for a second, with your firsthand knowledge and experience, with your extensive background, how freakishly outrageous is it for these very senior folks to cut across lanes and sort of echelons of authority to rig up this 2.5+ year lie?
Chris, I think that when the history of this is finally written, the fatal flaw of what happened here is going to be tossing aside the norm, and it's an important one, that the FBI and the Justice Department essentially want cases to be investigated out in the field offices where not only where the threat is or where a crime has occurred, if a crime has occurred. They want that done for two very important reasons. One, you're supposed to investigate things in the place where they happen, so it comports with our constitutional considerations.
Sure.
But secondly, and this is very important, it insulates the investigators from the craziness of Washington, the politics of Washington.
Exactly.
And it very importantly enables headquarters to play the role that headquarters is supposed to play, which is an oversight role And the reason that's important, I can say this as somebody who investigated cases for a long time. In every case that investigators have, you always think that your bad guys are the worst bad guys in the history of bad guys.
Sure.
And everybody, no matter how careful they are, always has a temptation to push the envelope in terms of what your investigative tactics are in order to make a case. There's nothing wrong with that because you want investigators to be aggressive. And the thing that allows you to have confidence that that will come out okay is the fact that headquarters and supervisors are there to play the role that they're supposed to play, which is to be the adult supervision
right.
that tells you, no, we don't bring uncorroborated anonymous screeds of information from alleged Russian officials to the FISA court unless we've corroborated the allegations. The sort of basic fundamental things that you wouldn't do in an investigation. You rely on headquarters to be the ones there to tell the line people, the line investigators and the line prosecutors, that there are institutional guidelines and procedural guidelines that have to be honored. And I think the problem here is that when you have this highly, highly unusual situation where headquarters actually decides to abandon its role and take over an investigation and run it itself, there's nobody there to tell them no when they have the same impulses that normal investigators have, which is to push the envelope,
right.
To do things that are at least edgy, if not worse than that. And I think what happened here is that you had supervisors actually conduct the investigation, and a lot of perspective was lost in terms of what their normal role is and what their role was in the four corners of these investigations. I mean, generally speaking, what you want to have happen is you want the prosecutors and the investigators on a case to make all of the investigative decisions and the prosecutive decisions that need to be made, with the understanding that the people up the chain of command are going to review those decisions, and they'll be the ones that are imposing the institutional guidelines and making sure that everybody stays in their correct lanes, as you put it before.
Right.
And that didn't happen here. And once that goes out the door, I think what you have is crazy kilt. I mean, basically you have people operating, one day, Strzok, for example, he's probably the best example to take here, right? One day he's a supervisor. Another day he's conducting an investigative interview in a criminal investigation. The next day he's running a counterintelligence investigation, but he's not really running it. He's actually getting on a plane and going to Europe to conduct interviews. So he's doing the field work. He's all over the mat.
Yeah, I refer to him as Super Agent Strzok. He's in his own category.
Yeah, except the problem with being a super agent, though, is that if you're doing everything, you're probably not doing anything particularly well.
Correct.
And, I think you see a lot of that across the board. And the other thing, and this is just a fact of life, Washington is hyper political. It's not a knock on the directors of these varying agencies to say that they have to take political considerations in mind. That's their job. That they're political appointees. They are charged, among other things, with carrying out the president's priorities in terms of enforcement and intelligence gathering. They deal with Congress. They deal with the White House. And by nature, their jobs are political. And their main job vis-a-vis individual investigations is to insulate the individual investigations from those political concerns that headquarters by nature has to deal with. And if headquarters is going to run an investigation, then it's going to be infected with politics. You can virtually guarantee it.
Absolutely. Listen, Andy, thank you very much. I can tell you that on behalf of my colleagues here at Judicial Watch, we always appreciate and value your experience, your analysis, your commentary. It's absolutely invaluable, particularly as there's more and more sort of hysteria around all of this what started out as a horrible hoax, and now we're seeing sort of the emotional and mental hangover from it. Your voice of reason is absolutely critical, and we appreciate you taking time to talk with us today.
Well, Chris, thanks so much. Us gas bags wouldn't have anything to talk about if Judicial Watch wasn't out there prying information away from people who don't want to have it pried from them. So a lot of us, thank God you're out there.
Thank you, Andy. Very nice to have a chance to talk with you today.
Take care.
I'm Chris Farrell on Watch.